like to begin my sermon this morning by sharing two stories with you. The first one took place a number of years ago. I was attending a leadership conference for pastors. And at one of the worship services, a pastor preached an impactful sermon on the need for clergy to honor the Sabbath rest. In essence, he reminded us that because the demands of pastoral ministry are great, we need to guard our day off as a time for rest and renewal. He referenced Jesus as the one we should emulate, reminding us that even in the midst of his busy ministry, Jesus purposely escaped for periods of solitude. After the service was over, I went over to the pastor to thank him for his message. As I approached, I heard him talking with some of his friends. I overheard as one of them said to him, "That sermon was really funny, coming from you. When is the last time you took a day off?" The pastor who preached the sermon confessed, "To be honest, I don't have any idea." The second story is about a retired pastor who was speaking with one of her colleagues. And in the midst of that conversation, she noted that during her time as a pastor, she felt the need to be available to her congregational members 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Looking back, she was able to reflect, there used to be a time when only God was that important. I begin my sermon by sharing those two stories because as I look at our Old Testament and Gospel lessons for this morning, I notice that they both focus on the Sabbath. But their messages appear to be a bit contradictory. Consequently, I find myself wrestling with the question, based on what Isaiah writes, and based on what Jesus said and did, what is it that we are to do with the Sabbath? Of course, the idea of Sabbath keeping is grounded in the third commandment. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. And while the Old Testament gives us two important reasons for honoring a Sabbath rest, let me focus on the one that is found in Exodus 20. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. The reason we are to keep the Sabbath is because God kept it. If God could take some time to rest, then certainly we too can take time to rest. After all, none of us would ever claim that we are more important than God. And yet, as I noted in my two opening stories, some people view themselves to be indispensable. They somehow think that the world, or at least their world, will fall apart if they are not available 24/7. And while the two people that I mentioned happen to be pastors, I have known other professionals for whom a day off was a rare exception. And frankly, with cell phones and laptop computers, any place can become a work environment. Any hour of the day can be a time to get work done. But keeping the Sabbath helps us to put things into perspective. We are not indispensable. The world can get along just fine without us for 24 hours. And significantly, we are more than just the sum total of the things that we do each day. And as I turn to our Old Testament lesson, our first lesson from Isaiah 58, the prophet shares some strong words with the children of Israel. To briefly give you some background information, the children of Israel returned from their captivity in Babylon, but they were already quickly lapsing into some of their old unfaithful ways. And one of those things was disregarding the Sabbath. One of the main issues that Isaiah observed was that rather than honoring the Sabbath by worshiping God and resting, they were dishonoring the Sabbath by pursuing their own endeavors and forcing those who worked for them to do the same thing. But Isaiah reminds them that the Sabbath is not for human profit. It is for God's glory. It is to be a day of rest for all people. By ignoring the gift that God had given to them, Isaiah accuses them of trampling on the Sabbath. But Isaiah offers them and us an alternative. If you call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going your own ways, serving your own interests, or pursuing your own affairs, then you shall take delight in the Lord. God gave us the Sabbath as a holy day, a day set apart to worship God, a day set apart for enjoying the creation around us, a day set apart for our own recreation, and ultimately a day set apart from every other day of the week. And when we honor the Sabbath this way, we truly take delight in the Lord, being renewed in body, mind, and spirit, and seeing more clearly the gifts that God gives to us each and every day. But as we turn to our gospel lesson for this morning, we notice that Jesus is involved in a dispute with a Jewish religious leader. A dispute that centers around something Jesus did on the Sabbath. And as we know from reading the Gospels, this was not an isolated incident. Jesus often did controversial things on the Sabbath. And consequently, the religious leaders basically accused him of trampling on the Sabbath, the very thing that Isaiah told the people not to do. In our lesson, from the 13th chapter of Luke, we discover that Jesus was teaching in the synagogue one Sabbath. A woman who had been crippled for 18 years entered, and Jesus called her over and immediately healed her. And as we heard, this action infuriated the synagogue leader. The fact that Jesus healed her was not the issue. The fact that Jesus healed her on the Sabbath was the problem. Over the centuries, after Isaiah had written his words, rabbis, concerned that people honor the Sabbath day and not trample on it, created a list of things that people shouldn't do on that day. A list of 39 different kinds of works that were strictly forbidden. And one of those forbidden works was healing, unless the person's life was in danger. And given the fact that this woman had endured this ailment for 18 years, she clearly could have waited one more day to be healed. But Jesus wanted to make a very strong point to the synagogue leader and to us. And so he poses this rhetorical question. Ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day? In healing this woman on the Sabbath, Jesus wasn't serving his own interests. He wasn't placing a burden on anyone else, the very things that Isaiah was concerned about. Instead, he was doing just the opposite. He was serving the interest of this woman. He was freeing her from her bondage. And in the process, he was reminding us that the Sabbath, just like any other day of the week, is a time for us to do good for others. So, what are we to do with the Sabbath? As the third commandment instructs us, we honor it. We honor it by setting it apart as a time to come and worship God. We honor it by setting it apart as a day for rest and recreation. And finally, as opportunities arise, we honor it by doing good, by reaching out to others who find themselves in need.